Portrait of a Fangirl is a web series and podcast created by Temple of Geek. At the core of the project is the importance of telling the stories of women who have found inspiration, growth, and power through fandom. My name is Jenna Wren, and I'm the host of the Portrait of a Fangirl podcast. And we have a special episode here for you today. We are discussing the phenomenon in the geek culture sphere that is known as post-con depression. Today, we have two special guests, and the first is our executive producer and the creator of Portrait of a Fangirl, Miss Monica Duarte, and licensed clinical social worker, Liliana Roque. Can you please both introduce yourselves to our audience and let us know a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hi, my name is Monica. I am the creator of Portrait of a Fangirl. I'm also the editor-in-chief at Temple of Geek and the Latinx correspondent over at that hashtag show. And I'm excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Liliana Roque. Like you mentioned, LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. I'm a psychotherapist going on almost 12 years. Most of my training is in complex traumas, but I dabble in a little bit of everything.
Okay, so we'll get a nice rounded view of the mental health sphere.
Definitely.
So, Liliana, the reason that we wanted to have you on today is to get your expert opinion on the idea of the post-con blues. Now, it's not a technical term. It's not something you're going to find in, the DSM, but within the community, it's something that's pretty well talked about. And it's this feeling of intense sadness coming off of something like a big comic convention, or sometimes you hear about it with music festivals or concerts, these very big events that people gather for. There are some articles on YouTube. There's a few things about it on the internet, but honestly, there's not much discourse happening about the post-con blues. It's something, for me at least, that I've only heard word of mouth by talking to friends and saying, oh, I'm back from this. I have the post-con blues, but there's no actual literature or reliable discourse on this topic. So I wanted to kick things off by talking about the first time that I've ever heard of the term, the post-con blues or depression. And then I'd love for Monica to jump in and also tell us her experiences. I honestly couldn't tell you the first time I heard it, just because it's so ingrained in the kind of subculture that I'm part of right now. But it's pretty much something that my friends and I all talk about when a convention's over. And you see it a lot on, mutuals, their stories, and say, oh, the con's over and now we all have the post-con blues. And I think the time it hit me the most, and when the idea and the realization that it's not being talked about, was this past summer in July after San Diego Comic-Con. So San Diego Comic-Con was something that Monica and I had been talking about for probably close to 6 months before the convention. And it was a big undertaking and a really important thing to us. And with a lot of milestone moments for the podcast and for, us as creators in general. So once the convention was over and the panel that we had ended and all the planning that we had put in came to a lull, and I got home, it hit really hard. And it's kind of like, well, now what? What do I do with myself? And, you miss everybody. So it's, as social beings too, you miss your friends. And I think that was the first time where I realized, hey, why isn't anyone talking about this? It's hurting me. I'm sure it's hurting other people. And what about you, Monica?
Well, I want to set up a little bit of context before, and just kind of talk about, leading up to the convention, Jenna was talking about how much she disliked her regular, 9-to-5 job, how unhappy and, how it was, kind of, sucking the energy and the life out of her, right? So all this fun stuff in planning and everything going into it, it was, the distraction from that. It was something to look forward to, this big event. And so there was a lot of different layers that were adding to this. And then at this convention, Jenna was kind of a little bit of a superstar because she had built these relationships that over the last few years, she's built relationships with PR people, with different people she's worked with in the industry. And it was all coming together in person, where like a lot of this had been virtual. She was getting a lot of praise for like her work on the podcast, her community building, and then she was a panelist at San Diego Comic-Con, which is not a small feat. Like it's not easy to be a panelist at like the industry's like biggest event. So it was a big deal that Jenna was there. It was a big deal that it was her first time there, and she was not only a panelist but interviewing celebrities, being treated out by like studios and things like that. She came as like a name with brand recognition and a lot of other things, and the planning was intensive and stressful to get to this point. And while she was there, she got to experience like all the people that she had made connections with in person. It was fun, it was exciting, it was nonstop, and it was a week worth event. It was like Wednesday through Sunday. And, and this is like a lot of people should only see once a year. It's a big kind of party environment too, because the afterlife at San Diego Comic-Con is every night is like a different industry party and this and that. And so it's not just I went to a convention and then I was sad. It was like this was a big deal. And the other time that I've seen it like very clearly, like in a friend, was when we went to a convention called Gallifrey One. It's a Doctor Who convention. And a gentleman reached out to me via Instagram. We followed each other because of cosplay and things like that. And he was like, hey, I'm thinking about going to this convention. I don't know anybody. Nobody in my friend group wants to come with me. My fiance doesn't want to come with me. Like, because it's this niche, like nerdy, geeky thing that where nobody like really got his enthusiasm. But he's like, maybe we can be friends. And he had reached out to me and to my husband and was like, maybe we can be friends. And I was like, yeah, we'll see you there. And first night we run into him. And since that, we were like inseparable. We had this big, huge weekend of like a party excitement. And he didn't have to explain his passion, his love, his excitement for something. He was already in the crowd of like-minded people. He was already there. He already like was accepted for who he was unapologetically. He didn't have to hide it or tone it down or anything. He could just be himself. And then suddenly he made all these new connections, all these friends. It was like this big fun time. And then on Monday, he went back to nobody understanding him, nobody getting him, nobody like really like feeling what he was all about. Right. And the same thing kind of happened to me when I first experienced it. And since I haven't had it as badly, because now I work in the community, in the industry, so it's a little different for me. I'm always in it. But when I was about 30 years old and I started going to conventions, it was the first time that I was like, oh, I don't have to hide how geeky I am. I don't have to be like, I was never bullied for being a geek or anything like that. Nobody ever treated me bad, but also nobody really got it. Nobody really understood. And they were just kind of like, it was tolerated. It wasn't like celebrated or anything like that. But when you go to a convention, you are celebrated and people are like, wow, like this is so great that you love this thing and blah, blah, blah. And it's like a lot of excitement. So afterwards, when I go back and nobody gets you, you're just like, oh. So that's basically our experience and kind of what we wanted to hear your feedback from. Why are we feeling these things so intensely? And like, what can we do to kind of like minimize, cope? I don't know what the wording is like.
Yeah, absolutely. I have heard of similar experiences and usually refer to it as the post-event blues or post-conference letdown. So it's common when you're transitioning from something that's super high stimulating or just really fulfilling to have to go back and engage in a regular day-to-day experience. Like the high to the low, it's just a really, really impactful difference in transition. I'd even go so far as to say like a lot of musicians feel the same thing, like when they're performing, and few things compare to that like outside of performing. So a lot of times they struggle for their mental health for similar reasons.
Is something chemically happening? Is it a release of endorphins when you're at these sort of events? Is there an explanation that way as well?
Oh, absolutely. All the happy things are happening there, and it's also concentrated. And then there's so much buildup to it, right? With anything that is exhilarating, there's a lot of dopamine happening, and some people have their natural dopamine, and some people have to get it store bought, right? So we just have to be really aware of how we get our dopamine and being sure that we are helping it level out on its own in a healthy way.
This happens in the cosplay community a lot, is where they're looking for their validation that they don't get anywhere else in life, right? But when they show up on the floor and they're wearing this amazing cosplay and they're getting recognition and things like that, they're finally feeling good about themselves. They have this external validation that they didn't have before. So now they're feeling good. And then they go back home and everything's the same. And so, like, I don't know, I feel like something with self-worth is somehow tied to this. Like, I don't know how you see that.
I mean, absolutely. Like you were describing earlier, most people like get people's hobbies, right? But most people aren't invested equally into other people's hobbies. So once you find a community that is, it enables each other, it encourages each other, right? And then there's also competition. There's also a lot of external validation that's going on, right? That is addicting. And if you don't have sort of a well-rounded, healthy distractions, well-rounded support system, it can be really hard to go from somewhere where you're getting all this praise or you're putting in all this effort to be validated in, right? And then transition to something that's all or none. It's important to be aware of how much effort is going into that external validation so that you can do your own self-work and make sure that it's not, your self-esteem isn't solely relying on that external validation. It's important to, in addition to the con, which is like the biggest event, right? It's an absolutely normal thing for parts of our self-esteem to come from different things, right? We can't have good self-esteem exclusively internal, right? Some of it does come from outside factors, and that's totally okay. We just have to make sure that we have enough self-awareness to know how much is coming from outside things and hopefully try to do what we can to balance it, right? Be proud of all the work we put into, making those costumes and being at those events, but also not being dependent on the response you get from those, people praising the costume or criticizing the costume, because if we focus too much on external validation, obviously it's going to be real subjective and it can be really fickle.
So for people who are struggling that way and only getting their validation from these big events, do they run the risk of kind of creating two selves?
I don't know that I would call it two selves so much as not being your genuine self the majority of the time, right? So I think things like, Temple of Geek and Portrait of a Fangirl, right? Like there's one big umbrella for it, but depending on your specific niche, like being a fangirl, right? Like you have an outlet. So to just be healthy, we have to be our most genuine selves, the majority of the time. And that's us embracing it. That's other people embracing it, right? So when you only have that one thing, all your eggs are in that basket, right? You don't get to be your authentic self. And that's detrimental. It can be detrimental to mental health.
And then I wonder, like, does this kind of have like the same feeling as like people who are, doing things for milestones, for example, like, getting validation from getting married, buying a home, having a big wedding, having kids and parties and things like that. Like, is that kind of similar or is that something different?
People who work the circuit, right? I think they could be really susceptible to it because they start off with a website and then a podcast and then they have their own panels and then they're interviewing, and it's just, those milestones and those achievements can be very addicting. And again, it's perfectly fine to have those things as long as outside of those things, you also have things that are, if not equally fulfilling, just fulfilling in general. I think socially, as grown-ups, we don't have hobbies, right? So people who have these really specific interests or really big interests, they don't get enough credit for actually how healthy it can be. The more hobbies, or I call them healthy distractions, that we can have, the better. We need at least, this is my thing, everyone needs at least 7 healthy distractions, 7 things that they can do predominantly alone. So sometimes it can involve other people, right? Going for a hike or going to a convention or whatnot. But the majority of things should be things that you could do alone on a Tuesday night or a Saturday afternoon that isn't incredibly expensive or reasonably priced that you can afford to wait to next payday to get one part of it or something like that.
So, for example, like with working out, right? Would that be like a healthy distraction, for example, on top of things? Or like you said, going to a hike, or maybe like crocheting while watching TV or something like that, right? Like,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Like, we need to do as many things that reasonably that we enjoy and create feelings of joy and satisfaction to maintain like our mental health. And unfortunately, in our society, grown-ups aren't really allowed to have things that they do just for fun, for no other reason than because they like it and, it creates feelings of joy and satisfaction.
It's funny because I was actually discussing this upcoming talk with my cousin, and I was telling her about, the topic, and she says, "Oh, we call that the post-concert depression because she attends a lot of concerts." So I never really thought of it in a way of being actually well spread among the community in all different senses. I mean, I guess, it could be something that happens if you go to a big sports game. It's this.
Well, actually, in everyday life. So after birthdays, after the holidays, after anything that's been built up, there's going to be this moment of peak, right? And so nothing really compares for after it. So the more meaningful something is for us, the more, we're going to feel the effects once it's passed. And then what? The what do we do next is actually not a bad question to ask. It's a healthy question to ask to figure out what can you do next so that you can just maintain healthy self-esteem and have healthy outlets.
So how do we differentiate between normal sadness after an event or something of the kind and depression?
There's definitely depressed feelings associated with that, right? And I don't want to split hairs as far as like depression and just, post-event blues, but definitely if it's harder to find joy in anything else, if it's affecting any kind of functioning, so like just getting out of bed, daily, life activities, if it's affecting work, if it's affecting friendships, if there's any kinds of thoughts of hopelessness or worthlessness, having greater suicidal thoughts, like then we know it's a little bit more than just being bummed out that like you lost that high of that really fun event. If it's disrupting daily life in some way, then it's something worth talking to someone, a professional about.
So how do we know that going to conventions and attending these events isn't just me trying to escape or distract myself from the regular anxieties of the world or depressions I may be feeling?
Something is a healthy distraction, right? When it adds more value to our overall well-being. It's an unhealthy distraction when it impairs our functioning, when we're avoiding things, when we're, not doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. So a little bit of distraction when we're anxious isn't always a bad thing, right? If we're using it to completely avoid something that's really important to do, then that's not healthy, right?
So what along those lines, what are some coping mechanisms that people can use to try to mitigate these feelings of depression that could come after?
Hopefully this doesn't sound a little bit too cliche, but honestly, all the things that we should be doing on a regular basis to just kind of keep our mental health in check, right? Being aware of our anxiety and where it's coming from, being aware of those depressed feelings and where they're coming from, being able to do things to relieve those feelings, not suppress them, right? People always throw out like meditation. Someone who's anxious doesn't know how to meditate, okay? But someone who's anxious might get a little bit of that nervous energy out when they go for a run or even for a walk, right? Again, not to sound cliche, but breathing is everything. Because when we are not breathing, we are not getting the oxygen we need to our brain, so then we can't think straight. So it's important to regulate our breaths. That helps regulate our nervous system, and that helps mitigate a lot of those anxious symptoms. Having Consistent social outlets, having a support system really helps. Having balanced, healthy distractions, and again, I'm afraid not to sound too cliche, but sleeping. I don't think enough grown-ups realize that, like, if you're not sleeping, if you're not getting the rest that you need, everything else is going to be affected. Everything else is going to suck. And if we're coming down from a really big high and not sleeping, right, things are just going to suck a little bit more. So regular healthy routines, being self-aware enough to sort of know if there's anxious symptoms or, full-blown anxiety that you might need some, help talking through with a professional.
Oh, you mentioned something about like releasing anxiety versus suppressing it. What does suppressing it look like?
A lot of people have such a stigma against being sad or being down, and they're just like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be positive, right? I actually have a huge bias against like positive thinking because I don't think it's practical. Usually the neutral place to go is, what is fact? What is true? And if something is sad or sucks or it's whatever, it's allowed to be that thing. So allowing yourself a reasonable amount of time to be sad, right? Or to be upset about something is allowed. Forbidding yourself from feeling the negative things isn't a healthy outlet, or not outlet. Forbidding yourself from feeling the negative things is suppressing it, as opposed to reasonably allowing yourself to sort of process any of those feelings. On the other end, I would say, or rather, what am I trying to say? Another part of that is the healthy distractions, right? People say, oh, well, those are just avoiding issues. And I'm like, not actually, because as long as they're creating feelings of joy and satisfaction, then it's not avoiding, right? Have you ever noticed that when you're in a good mood, you just handle things better? So your brain is still processing all the things that you're thinking and feeling, but when you're actually doing something that creates feelings of, fulfillment or joy, you're just processing it with a better perspective, essentially. You're not going out of your way to like avoid something, to suppress something, not think about something. You're just focusing on something that you really enjoy. And like that's allowed. And that's actually helpful.
Coming from the mental health side, are there specific therapies that are particularly effective for people who are suffering from depression triggered by an event?
That's an interesting question. I'm going to start off by saying that while there are modalities out there that in theory could, really help with certain diagnoses or whatever issues you might be dealing with, ultimately the best modality is going to be whomever like you're working with, what they know and how they can explain it the best that they can. But that's the long-winded version, right? The more complex version. Up front, I can say, yeah, CBT. So like things that focus on thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. Like that's one modality that can be really helpful. Interpersonal therapy, because that just kind of helps with communication and figuring out like your position amongst, your support system, those communities that you're involved with, and being able to better articulate your needs in those interpersonal relationships, right? Just being able to have someone to talk to and say things out loud to helps our brains process, what we're thinking and feeling. So that just in itself is really helpful.
I find sometimes too that like sometimes when I'm carrying a thought, it's like so heavy and it's wearing on me or whatever. But then when I say it out loud, it's like, oh, it wasn't that bad. Like it's like I just let it out, like actually saying it to somebody versus just letting it ruminate in my head.
Absolutely. So that speaks to the reason that like journaling and therapy in general work. In our brains, there's just no rules, right? We can say the most outlandish, absurd things, and there's nothing, policing it. So that can really impact our mood, our thoughts, our perspective, everything, right? The minute we put our thoughts down on paper, or once we start saying them out loud, there's rules, right? And so we are forced to finish our thoughts. We're forced to say things more accurately. And it's not just this insane catastrophe, right, in our brains. So essentially, that's why journaling, that's why therapy works.
I have like a story that I feel like goes in with this, but I don't know how to like fit it in. So I'm gonna just ask it, and if it works, it works. If not, I'm gonna tell it and ask it. So with San Diego Comic-Con, for instance, when Monica was discussing, how big of an event this was, and how the crash down could be very easy. I'm taken back to a specific memory of literally when I was driving out of San Diego. Within like 10 minutes, I could feel, and I do suffer from an anxiety disorder, but I could feel like a panic attack coming on. And luckily, I am aware of myself enough to go, this is adrenaline wearing off. This is adrenaline coming down. And is adrenaline also really involved in this? Is that a part of this high and low that kind of controls people's feelings when it comes to these post-con anxieties and depressions?
Oh, absolutely. It's the same with the runner's high. And, again, that dopamine is everything. And it's good that you are self-aware and understand where that's coming from, right? In an ideal situation, knowing that you have some anxiety, knowing that like those conventions create such high highs, right? It would actually be a really good idea to incorporate times when you're doing like check-ins with your own body, with your own nervous system, and you're like being more self-aware to be able to regulate your nervous system a little bit more throughout the conference, so that maybe that adrenaline won't get so carried away.
So how long can people really expect to feel this way? Is there a typical timeline that one can expect for, I guess you could call it, recovery?
That's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis, right? Because some people who have a little bit more support, or maybe have a little bit more well-rounded activities or social outlets, might not fall as hard, right? Or if they do fall hard, there's a support system there to sort of catch them on the way down. There's other people who don't get as high up during that time as others, right? So they don't have to come down as much. It's going to be, there's so many factors involved in that, in determining that, right? So there shouldn't be a timeline put on it. The focus should definitely be put more on making sure that you enjoy other things, making sure that that you're not having any negative thoughts of hopelessness or worthlessness, and that none of your daily functioning is being impaired. Because it could last, right, like 6 months. But if you're still functioning, going to work, then that sounds more like being a little bit of a Debbie Downer, maybe a little bit pessimistic. But if you're functioning, then it just is.
Right. And now following up on that, what are some signs that depression might be getting worse, or is at a point where somebody should actually seek additional help?
Affecting daily functioning is definitely a big marker, right? Because it's one thing that after the post-con event, right, you might be a little bit down and even a little bit tired for a little bit after, and you don't want to go out, and that's fine, right? The problem comes when you want to go out and you can't, right? So when there's things that we need to do or want to do and we don't find ourselves capable of doing it, then it's definitely worth talking to a professional just to sort of see, where you're at, and if, preventative care more than anything. I think with most things, if someone just kind of feels validated, then things are easier to cope with. So being encouraging for them to do whatever they need to feel better, whether that's seeking professional help or just getting back out there with their Geek squad, whatever that might look like for them, right? Making sure that they're spending quality time. If not, if you're not spending quality time with them, that they're spending quality time with somebody. Avoiding judgment or criticism, because just because, they don't feel the exact same way doesn't mean that they can't empathize and understand how big of a deal it is for, the person that they care about. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, but it is, in most of my therapy that I've ever done, it's encouraging having the social connections, the creative outlets, the professional support, goal setting, things that you're looking forward to, healthy lifestyle, and just those healthy distractions. The more aware you are and self-aware you are, the more you can prepare, the more you can do your best to address any issues.
There's also this like other side of where like you're building up an event, right? Like, or building a cosplay or something, and it doesn't go the way that you wanted it to, right? You've been building this up for so long, and then everything that could have gone wrong does go wrong, and it's like this huge letdown. Like, how do we avoid kind of like spiraling into like negative thinking or negative thoughts or something unhealthy?
More often than not, how we do one thing is how we do everything. So if you're somebody who organizes an event and needs to have every single thing, in order, if that's probably how you are with most events, right? If you're someone that needs a lot of planning, like it's not going to be in an isolated situation.
So, for example, it sounds like what you're saying is like if you are somebody who is, being really let down by this event because it didn't go perfectly, it's not probably just an isolated incident. Like you probably are easily let down by other things in life. Like,
yeah, I mean, if you're type A, you probably know it, And if there's a lot of pressure on this really big event, it's just going to be worse. I think, calling a spade is also important. And I want to stress that a lot of our idiosyncrasies don't have to be diagnosable. Because honestly, if someone's super type A, right, and really high strung and all of those things, but it's helping them in their life, they're functioning well, and they're doing well with it, right, then it's not a problem. It might bug other people, but that's their problem, right? So it's only when the person in question is not okay because of those things that it becomes a problem.
Do you think that the fact that there really isn't discourse on this in, specifically in the terms of this conversation and this podcast within the geek community, do you think that since there's not this discourse, that people aren't necessarily seeking out the support that they need?
Oh, absolutely. First and foremost, major, props to you guys for even delving into this conversation. Because like we said, it's not just at big events or concerts. It's also after Christmas, after your kid's first birthday, after, actually after, like once you give birth even, right? Whenever there's a lot of buildup, there's going to be issues. And thankfully, we're actually coming to an age of a lot more self-awareness. The mental health field is definitely getting, creeping itself into different aspects of life. And that can only help us all.
Right. And we all need it. We all could use the help, I'm sure. Well, Liliana, this has been a really great conversation. And I think you have highlighted some points that really need to be talked about in not just the geek community, but the communities as a whole. Really, thank you for coming on today and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me. And again, major props to you guys for tackling the issue.